They didn't just fire me, they performed it. Like a show. Right there, in front of 24 colleagues, the HR director read out my termination notice, while my manager stood with his arms folded, wearing the same smug smile he'd flashed at me during every meeting I dared to speak in. The word terminated echoed in that cold glass conference room like a verdict. And the worst part? Everyone clapped. Well, not for me, of course. For him. He was the company's golden boy, the rising star, Ryan Keller, Director of Operations at Bright Core Technologies. I had been his right hand, the one who cleaned up his data, polished his reports, and fixed his numbers at 2 a.m. while he took credit at 9. I'd worked there for 7 years. 7 years of loyalty, overtime, and unspoken sacrifices. And, just like that, I was let go for misconduct. Misconduct. That word burned. As I packed up my things, I could hear whispers behind me. Guess she crossed Ryan. Didn't she handle the CEO's accounts? He must have found something. I wanted to scream, to tell them the truth that Ryan had framed me. But I couldn't. Not yet. The HR director, Angela, avoided my eyes as she slid the final envelope across the table. Effective immediately, Amelia, she said, voice cold, mechanical. You'll receive your severance under Clause 9.2 of your contract. Clause 9.2. I'd written that clause myself when I was part of the CEO's private restructuring team. Back then, the CEO, Harold Grant, trusted me enough to help rewrite the company's employee retention framework. A clause that protected senior staff against unfair dismissal. But Harold had retired 3 months ago, and Ryan had wasted no time erasing every trace of the people Harold had trusted. People like me. I looked at the envelope and thought, you have no idea what you've just triggered. But at that moment, I didn't say a word. Instead, I nodded, thanked Angela, and walked out with my head high, even though my stomach felt like it was collapsing in on itself. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment surrounded by folders, contracts, and shredded confidence. I couldn't even bring myself to eat. I kept replaying the scene in my head, Ryan's smirk, the fake concern on his assistant's face, the way people avoided eye contact like I was contagious. I opened my laptop and reread the email they'd sent me, each word stabbing deeper. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated under Clause 9.2 following a breach of confidentiality regarding client data. That line. Breach of confidentiality. I hadn't breached anything. But Ryan had. He was the one who had been selling internal project data to our competitors, quietly, systematically. I had discovered traces of it a month earlier, tucked inside harmless-looking invoices. I'd confronted him privately, expecting guilt or maybe panic. Instead, he'd laughed. You're cute when you think you're smarter than me, Amelia, he'd said. I built this place. You're just lucky to be here. I remember the way he leaned back, hands folded behind his head. If you try to make trouble, you'll regret it. I promise. Back then, I thought it was arrogance. Now I knew it was a threat. A week before my firing, things had already started to feel off. My emails disappeared. My access to confidential folders suddenly expired. My name was conveniently left off reports I'd authored. When I asked IT, they said, it must be an error. But errors don't happen 3 times in a row. Then came the whispers, people in the break room stopping mid-conversation when I entered, the forced smiles, the pitying looks. Something was happening. I could feel it, like the air before a storm. Still, I ignored the signs. I told myself I was overthinking. I'd always been too emotional, too invested, too eager to prove myself. That's what they'd said, at least. So when the final meeting invite came, urgent, compliance review, 9 a.m., I thought it was just another audit. I even brought donuts for the team. And then, by 9:15, I was unemployed. Now, sitting there in my dimly lit apartment, my mind spun between rage and disbelief. How could he do this? I scrolled through old company documents, emails, and contracts, everything I'd ever saved. That's when I saw it again, Clause 9.2, the same one they had cited to fire me. Except, they hadn't read it carefully. Because Clause 9.2 wasn't just a termination clause. It was a protection clause. It required that any employee terminated for cause must undergo a full third-party audit before final approval of dismissal. And that audit? It still listed me as the contact point. They thought they'd erased me, but I was still in the system. A quiet chill ran through me as I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere between humiliation and heartbreak, something inside me began to shift. They'd turned my career into a spectacle, but the show wasn't over. Not even close. I whispered to myself, almost smiling, "Ryan, you fired the wrong person." And though I didn't know it yet, that one overlooked clause would freeze their careers, not mine. Before they fired me in front of everyone, there were signs. Tiny, quiet warnings that I brushed aside because I didn't want to believe them. At Bright Core Technologies, things had always been sharp, fast, and competitive, the kind of place where people smiled at you while secretly counting your mistakes. I had learned how to survive there, stay focused, stay useful, stay invisible when necessary. But after Harold Grant, our old CEO, retired, the tone changed overnight. Ryan Keller, my manager, had always been ambitious, but suddenly, that ambition had teeth. He wanted control over everything. At first, it was subtle. He started skipping my name during team updates. My weekly project reports, which used to be praised, began returning with curt comments, "Redo." Not aligned with new strategy. When I'd ask what new strategy meant, he'd smile that thin, tight smile of his. "You'll catch up eventually, Amelia. You're smart, I don't need to spell everything out." That was his favorite line, a compliment that felt like an insult. One Friday afternoon, I stayed late to finish the financial projections for our next quarter. Ryan was still in his office, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low tones. Through the glass, I could see his reflection, relaxed, confident, smirking. Then I caught one word that made my stomach drop. Confidential. He was reading out figures that hadn't been released yet, data that only 3 people had access to, including me. My instincts screamed at me to record it, to confront him, to do something. But I didn't. Instead, I looked away, pretending to focus on my spreadsheet. I told myself I must have misheard. Maybe it was an internal discussion. Maybe I was just paranoid. Because admitting that Ryan, the man I'd worked beside for years, could be breaking company policy, even the law, meant admitting that everything I'd believed about loyalty and trust was a lie. Monday came, and the office felt off. People were too quiet when I walked by. One of my teammates, Jenna, avoided eye contact completely. During our morning huddle, Ryan announced a new initiative, one that sounded eerily like a project I had proposed 2 weeks earlier. He didn't mention my name. Not once. Everyone clapped anyway. "Brilliant, Ryan," someone said. He nodded graciously, like a king accepting applause. Then he glanced at me, that same condescending flicker of a look, as if daring me to speak. I didn't. A few days later, HR called me in for a routine review. Angela, the HR director, smiled too much. Her tone was syrupy sweet, the kind people use when they're lying. "Amelia, we've had a few concerns about your recent reports," she said, tapping her pen. "Some inconsistencies, perhaps?" I frowned. Inconsistencies? Yes. Missing attachments. Wrong figures. Things that don't quite align with the data submitted by your team. My team. The same team Ryan supervised. I opened my mouth to protest, but she raised her hand. "No one's blaming you, dear. These things happen. Just double-check your work next time." That word again. Dear. The polite way to tell someone you're being watched. When I left her office, my hands were trembling. I went back to my desk, opened the files, and sure enough, the numbers were wrong. Not by much, but enough to raise suspicion. I knew I hadn't made those mistakes. Someone had tampered with them. Still, I said nothing. Because if I accused Ryan without proof, I'd look unstable, emotional. The kind of woman who couldn't handle authority. So, I did what I always did. I smiled, worked harder, and convinced myself it would all sort itself out. That weekend, I met my friend Lisa for coffee. She worked in another department, but had always been honest with me, brutally so. "You look exhausted," she said, studying me. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just busy." She sipped her latte, not buying it. "Ryan's been spending a lot of time with the execs lately. People say he's positioning himself for Harold's old role." I felt my stomach twist. He wouldn't. Oh, he would, she interrupted. And if you're standing in the way, he'll move you. Simple as that. I laughed it off, but my chest tightened. He's not like that. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Amelia, he's exactly like that. You just don't want to see it. Her words stuck with me long after she left. By the following week, the red flags weren't red anymore. They were flashing neon. Ryan started holding private meetings with my direct reports. I'd catch them whispering afterward, exchanging nervous glances. My access to project dashboards suddenly expired again. My calendar invites disappeared. And then, one morning, my nameplate was gone from my cubicle. I stared at the empty space on the desk, where Amelia Hart, senior operations analyst, used to sit, and for a split second, something in me cracked. I walked straight into Ryan's office. Is there a reason my access keeps getting revoked? I asked, voice steady but cold. He looked up from his phone and smiled lazily. Oh, that must be an IT glitch. A glitch that only affects me? He shrugged. Maybe the system knows something we don't. I froze. What's that supposed to mean? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Relax, Amelia. Don't be so defensive. You're starting to look paranoid. Paranoid. The same word abusers use when their victims start waking up. I left his office without another word, but inside, something was shifting. The doubt was still there, but beneath it, a spark of anger. A whisper in the back of my mind, he's setting you up. I didn't want to believe it. But deep down, I already knew. I'll never forget the sound of my own name echoing across that glass conference room, the sound that ended my career in one sentence. Amelia Hart, Ryan said, standing at the head of the table, his tone sharp and rehearsed. Effective immediately, your employment with Bright Core Technologies is terminated. At first, I thought I'd misheard him. The room was full, department heads, HR, even the CEO. Everyone's eyes flicked toward me, some in pity, others in satisfaction. I sat there frozen, notebook still open, pen still in my hand. My heart hammered so loudly that I could barely hear the rest of his words. After a full review, Ryan continued smoothly. We discovered major discrepancies in your financial reports, as well as unauthorized access to confidential data. A murmur spread around the table. He let it build, like an orchestra he was conducting. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but my throat locked. It felt like someone had pressed mute on my voice. Confidential data. That phrase stabbed through me. He was using his crime, the one I'd overheard him commit, and pinning it on me. The CEO, a cold man named Brantley, leaned forward. We take data breaches seriously, Amelia. HR will escort you out. And, just like that, it was over. No questions. No chance to explain. Just silence. I walked out of that room numb, the eyes of my colleagues burning into my back. A security guard followed me, an actual guard, as I packed my things. The same coworkers who used to greet me every morning suddenly found the floor fascinating. When I passed Jenna, she whispered, I'm sorry. Sorry didn't fix anything. Sorry didn't erase the humiliation. By the time I reached the elevator, my tears were blurring everything. But I refused to let them fall until I was outside. The wind hit my face the moment the doors opened, and that's when I broke. Right there on the sidewalk, surrounded by strangers, I cried, not because I'd lost my job, but because I'd lost my belief in people. I'd been loyal, hardworking, honest. And the man I trusted, the man I defended, had turned me into a scapegoat. It wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. He'd stolen my work, my reputation, and then used my silence as a weapon against me. And the cruelest part? I'd seen it coming. Every red flag. Every manipulation. Every subtle insult I'd brushed off as stress. All of it had been the setup. I replayed every conversation, every late-night email, every friendly compliment. And the more I thought, the clearer it became. He'd been laying the groundwork for months. The fake errors in my reports. The missing attachments. The deleted calendar invites. He'd been building a narrative, one where I looked careless, emotional, unreliable. And I'd walked right into it. That night, I sat on my couch in silence. My laptop blinked with unread emails, news spreading fast through the company. Bright core analyst fired for data breach. That's what the memo said. Underneath, a quote from Ryan, "Integrity is non-negotiable in leadership." I almost laughed. Integrity. The word tasted like ash. I opened my personal drive and searched through old backups. Luckily, I had saved everything: reports, messages, screenshots, fragments of truth I hadn't realized would become evidence one day. And as I pieced them together, a story emerged. The confidential data he accused me of accessing, it matched the exact figures he'd leaked over the phone weeks ago. The timestamps lined up. The audit trail, though altered, had a hidden layer, one he'd failed to wipe completely. I stared at the screen, my tears drying into something else. Rage. Not loud or violent, but cold, sharp, deliberate. The kind of anger that doesn't scream. The kind that plans. Over the next few days, the world moved on without me. My name was smeared in industry circles. Recruiters stopped calling. Even friends grew distant, afraid to be associated. But I didn't hide. I started documenting everything, every file, every Slack message, every trace of manipulation. I even reached out to Lisa, the one friend I still trusted. When she came over, I showed her everything. She read in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Then she looked up, eyes wide. "Oh my God, Amelia," she whispered. "He set you up. This is corporate fraud." I nodded. "And I can prove it." Lisa hesitated. "What are you going to do?" I smiled for the first time in days, a tired, dangerous smile. "I'm going to let him think he won." For the first time since that meeting, my mind felt clear. Yes, I was angry. Yes, I was broken. But beneath that pain, something powerful was stirring, a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. Because here's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't destroy you. It refines you. And Ryan? He thought he'd buried me. He didn't realize I was a seed. For 3 days after they fired me, I didn't leave my apartment. The blinds stayed closed, the coffee went cold, and I stared at the ceiling wondering how everything I'd built vanished overnight. The humiliation burned worst at 3 a.m. when my mind replayed every second of that meeting: Ryan's smug tone, the CEO's indifferent face, the pity in my coworkers' eyes. I kept thinking someone would call, HR, legal, even Brantley, the CEO, to apologize for the misunderstanding. But no one did. That's when it hit me. No one was coming. No one was going to clear my name, restore my dignity, or give me back the years I'd poured into that company. If I wanted justice, I'd have to carve it out myself. The shift happened quietly, not in anger, but in clarity. I sat at my desk, reopened my laptop, and looked at the chaos of files I'd gathered. Suddenly, it didn't feel like the scraps of a ruined career. It felt like ammunition. Ryan thought I was broken. He thought the public firing had silenced me, that I'd retreat in shame while he paraded his false victory. He didn't understand that humiliation doesn't destroy everyone. Sometimes it builds something unbreakable. And that something was me. By the 4th night, I was dissecting the employee handbook line by line, a document most people skim once and forget. But I remembered a clause I'd stumbled across years ago while working on compliance reports. It was called the CEO's clause. It stated that any employee terminated for cause, especially under allegations affecting data integrity, triggered an automatic internal audit by an independent third-party firm. In other words, if they fired me for a data breach, the company was legally required to open its books to an external investigator. And if Ryan really had been the one leaking information, that audit could expose everything. My pulse quickened. I double-checked the company's bylaws and the external compliance agreement filed with the SEC. It was all there, binding, enforceable, and time-stamped. He hadn't just framed me. He'd accidentally set the stage for his own downfall. The only problem? The CEO hadn't activated the clause yet. I needed to make sure that happened, without it looking like I was behind it. The next morning, I went back to the office building. My badge didn't work anymore, but I didn't need to get inside. I just needed to see who came and went. From the cafe across the street, I watched Ryan step out with his usual arrogance, phone pressed to his ear, fake laugh echoing across the plaza. He looked untouchable. But I knew something he didn't. and that knowledge was enough to steady my shaking hands. I opened my laptop and began writing. Not to HR. Not to Ryan. But to the CEO himself, Mr. Brantley. The email was calm, professional, and impossible to ignore. Subject: Compliance Inquiry. Termination Protocol under Section 9C. Dear Mr. Brantley, I'm reaching out to confirm whether the independent audit required under the CEO's clause, Section 9C of the Compliance Agreement, has been initiated following my termination. Given the public nature of the announcement and the stated reason of data integrity breach, federal compliance may require documentation of the external review. Best regards, Amelia Hart. I knew the CEO wasn't a man who liked loose ends, especially ones that could cost him his reputation. Within an hour, I received a short, cold reply. We'll review this immediately. Brantley. That one line changed everything. I closed my laptop and leaned back, heart pounding. For the first time since that awful day, I smiled, not out of revenge, but relief. I'd planted a seed in the most powerful man's mind. A seed wrapped in compliance and legality, impossible to ignore. And when that audit started, Ryan's carefully built lies would unravel on their own. That night, I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the same one who'd been escorted out of the office in tears. Her eyes were sharper now, still tired, but focused. I realized I didn't need anyone's validation to feel powerful. My worth wasn't tied to a title or paycheck. It was in my ability to rise after being buried. And more than revenge, I wanted truth. Truth that would restore not just my name, but my peace. I started taking care of myself again. Morning runs replaced sleepless nights. Fresh coffee replaced cold cups. Every small act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that Ryan had tried to erase. Lisa noticed the change when she visited. You seem different, she said, sipping her tea. I am, I told her. He thought I was finished. But he doesn't realize I've just begun. The next week, whispers began circulating in the company. The compliance team had been contacted by the CEO's office. The external audit was confirmed. Ryan started sweating, literally and metaphorically. He began deleting old messages, restricting file access, even canceling meetings. Too late. The machine had already been set in motion. And all I had to do now was wait. As I stood outside the bright core building one last time, watching the glass windows gleam in the sun, I whispered to myself, "You fired me publicly. But now your careers are about to freeze quietly." The wind carried my words away, but my heart felt lighter. Because revenge wasn't about rage anymore. It was about reclaiming power, piece by piece, with the same calm precision they used to destroy me. When you're trying to bring down a man who built his power on charm and borrowed credit, loud anger is useless. What works is silence that looks harmless, patience that looks like retreat, and evidence that looks inevitable. For 2 days after Brantley confirmed the audit, I did the one thing Ryan would never expect. I disappeared into the background and began to collect what he had been too arrogant to destroy. The first move was practical. I had copies. Not just my personal backups, which I'd long ago moved to an encrypted drive after a paranoia-fueled late night, but artifacts most people ignore. Version histories, file creator tags, voice memos where I talked through the algorithm, and archived Slack threads. Those breadcrumbs were scattered across personal and shared spaces. He thought deleting visible files would bury the truth. He didn't realize the internet keeps receipts. Still, raw files without witnesses are just files. You need people who will look at them and not blink. So I started with Raj. Raj was the kind of quietly brilliant IT guy who knew the server like a second brain and kept his head down. I'd always been friendly to him, brought him coffee, asked dumb questions about backups until he warmed up. Now I needed him to see the logs with fresh eyes. I walked into his tiny office with the calm of a woman buying a book, not planting a bomb. "Hey," I said, sliding a USB across his desk. "Can you look at something for me? I'm trying to tidy my archives." He raised an eyebrow, plugged it in, and the files lit up on his monitor. I watched his expression tighten as he scrolled through the metadata. Timestamp after timestamp. Creator tags with my initials. Then a thread of forwarded messages that, on the surface, looked routine, until Raj scrolled further and saw echoes, emails to a private account, tiny delays, subtle renames. He didn't say much. He just nodded and closed the cabling drawer like a man who had seen a fault line. "You keep backups?" he asked quietly. "Always," I said. "Do you think, if the auditors check server logs, will they see forwarded copies?" My voice sounded casual, but my heart thudded. "They'll see whatever's left there," he replied. "If someone tried to masquerade as another user, there will be traces. Not everyone knows how to scrub metadata right." His finger tapped a line on the screen. "If you want, I can pull an immutable snapshot for you." I left him with a dozen excuses and a thank you. In reality, I left with the knowledge that the technical foundation for my case could stand a formal review. Next, I needed social proof. Ryan's empire of influence rested on people who loved the story he told about himself, the visionary, the fixer, the charismatic leader. To crack that story, I had to find the people who'd seen the edits and the transfers and who, out of fear, loyalty, or ignorance, had stayed quiet. I began planting seeds. At a small industry mixer, I made sure to linger near Lydia from Investor Relations. "I've been reviewing past deliverables," I said casually over wine, and noticed a few oddities between the final decks and their claimed authorship. "You ever notice that?" I let the question hang like an incense smoke, faint, suggestive. She blinked, checked her phone, then lowered her voice. "We did. We thought it was just a supply chain mislabel. I'll look into it." Later that week, she sent a private message asking me to forward anything I had. Another quiet ally. I also cultivated small, accidental confrontations that weren't confrontational at all. I smiled at Ryan, laughed at his jokes, and accepted his invitations, while always carrying my little arsenal, a thumb drive hidden in my purse, printouts tucked into a folder, and a copy of the CEO's clause bookmarked on my phone. He watched my public humiliation like a man admiring a completed sculpture. He did not know I'd pocketed the tools. Then there was Melissa. She'd been young and afraid when Ryan put her on the Vantage account. Over lunch one afternoon, I was deliberately open, not with accusations but with warmth. "How's Vantage going?" I asked. She hesitated, then unloaded the small humiliations Ryan had used to nudge her into stepping over me, the phrasing he insisted on, the slides he coached her to steal from my drafts. Tears came, soft and embarrassed. "I didn't know it was like that," she whispered. He told me everyone agreed. That afternoon, she gave me an email she'd used to request a resource allocation, a template with headers only I used. It was tiny, easily dismissed, except when you start stacking tiny things together. Evidence, at scale, becomes a pattern. I worked with Lisa, my friend, to craft the narrative the auditors would find compelling, chronological, unemotional, and clinically precise. We created a timeline that began months before my firing and mapped each suspicious action, revoked access, missing attachments, forwarded drafts, and the dates Ryan accessed files outside his role. We annotated it with server logs Raj pulled and with copies of my original files from my encrypted drive. Each element was labeled, cross-referenced, and timestamped. My most delicate maneuver was anonymous. I wrote to a respected compliance journalist under a pseudonym, suggesting that an audit may reveal deeper issues at Brightcore. The note was factual, not vindictive, and it landed on a desk that liked digging. I didn't want headlines yet, just someone curious enough to prod. All the while, Ryan strutted around the office believing I was a cautionary tale, humiliated, powerless, and forgotten. He posted selfies at investor lunches, sent smug, get-well messages to mutual colleagues, and joked about how the next trimester would be his moment. When I passed him in the hallway, he offered a patronizing smile. I returned it like someone watching an actor rehearse a goodbye scene. The plan was not one dramatic reveal, but a slow construction of inevitability. Evidence would meet procedure, procedure would meet auditors, auditors would find the discrepancy between what Ryan told the board and what the log files proved. The CEO's clause would force the third-party review. The review would open doors. The doors would let in light. I slept less. I moved faster. Each small victory, Raj's snapshot, Lydia's forwarded note, Melissa's email, felt like a tiny thaw in the frost he'd built around my life. On the night I finished the dossier, a clean PDF with exhibits, timelines, and contact references, I didn't celebrate. I didn't shout. I sat on my couch, the city lights bleeding through my blinds, and felt only a patient calm. The anger was still there, but now it was sharpened into something purposeful. Tomorrow, the auditors would begin. Ryan still believed he'd won. He still thought I was the scandal he'd manufactured. He couldn't see what I could, the quiet mechanics of a clause he'd scoffed at, the way law and procedure move like freight, slow, heavy, unstoppable once engaged. I saved the dossier to an encrypted drive, labeled the folder Compliance Inquiry, and for the first time since they dragged me out of that conference room, I slept without nightmares. When I woke up, I smiled, not because I expected immediate vindication, but because I'd stopped being the victim in my own story. They'd performed my firing on a stage. It was time to change the set. They staged the meeting on a gray Tuesday, the kind of day that makes glass buildings look like low clouds. I arrived early, not because I wanted to see them fall, but because precision is a quiet ritual. I folded my hands in my lap, smoothed the navy blazer I wore like armor, and waited. The boardroom smelled of coffee and expensive leather. The CEO's office had summoned the compliance team, the external auditors, and a handful of investors. Ryan walked in with the same measured confidence he always wore, practiced smile, eyes hunting the room for allies. He still thought he'd built himself a fortress. The auditor began with numbers. That was the sound of truth peeling a mask, timestamps, version histories, immutable snapshots. Raj sat near the projector and clicked through server logs the way a conductor signals the orchestra. Each click revealed a tiny betrayal, a forwarded file here, an access outside normal hours there, an approval chain with missing links. The screen filled with evidence in black and white, and the room's warm air cooled. Ryan tried the old tactic, charm and deflection. He smiled, attempted to thread the narrative about team collaboration and synthesizing ideas. But syntax couldn't cover the metadata. The auditor's voice stayed calm, clinical, unpitying. The documentation shows primary authorship associated with Amelia Hart's accounts. There are recorded transmissions from Mr. Keller to an external address that align with internal release dates. She paused, then added softly, "We also found evidence suggesting deliberate obfuscation of who submitted the final investor deck." The sound in the room turned thin. Investors tapped screens. The CEO's face turned from polite to pinched. Then Melissa stood up. She'd come voluntarily at my ask, palms lightly trembling. She read from a notebook, not accusatory but exact, phrases Ryan coached her to use, slides he'd insisted on, offhand remarks about letting Amelia have the grunt work. Her voice didn't break. It was steady because she'd practiced honesty in private and would not practice complicity in public. Journalists, although not yet in the room, had their inboxes primed. The compliance office's summary, clinical and devastating, landed in the hands of a reporter who loved data as much as scandal. Within hours, headlines began to bloom. Brightcore under audit, director suspended, allegations of data misappropriation shake tech firm. Ryan's first defense frayed under the light. He lunged for legalese and pivoted to charisma, but he couldn't put back the files the auditors had verified. Contracts he'd claimed to author were stamped with my initials in creation metadata. The chain of custody was no longer a rumor, it was a timeline. When the CEO finally spoke, it was not the robust defense Ryan had hoped for. "Until this is fully investigated," Brantley said, voice flat, "Mr. Keller will be placed on administrative leave pending outcomes." It was a business decision, clean, unemotional, and final. For Ryan, it felt like a guillotine disguised as paperwork. The next hours unraveled like a public peeling. Clients called for emergency meetings. An investor demanded immediate transparency. One long-standing partner paused a multi-million-dollar rollout pending audit clarification. Payments scheduled under Ryan's discretion were temporarily frozen. Legal counsel issued a hold on discretionary transfers. The mechanisms of power, bank accounts, contracts, reputations, all dependent on trust, sputtered. Outside, the story spread like a stain. In the office, people watched their lunchtime feeds instead of their lunch. Some glared at me. Some looked away as if embarrassment could be contagious. I sat quiet through it all, fingers interlaced, breathing slow. I felt no triumph, only a profound, luminous relief. Truth had moved through the system and found its place. At one point, as cameras created a soft jungle of lenses in the lobby, Ryan tried to meet my eye. I did not flinch. There was a moment, a small, exquisite moment, when his practiced composure broke and something raw showed through, a flash of fear, then the pale resignation of a man whose script had been cut. Legal notices followed. The external auditors recommended an expanded forensic review. The board accepted. The CEO invoked corporate policies that suddenly mattered. The clause I'd written long ago, intended to protect honesty, and the people who upheld it, began to behave like a legal revenant. It forced open doors he had slammed shut. I gave a statement later that day, brief, factual, not performative. I welcomed the audit, I said into a microphone that suddenly felt less like a tribunal and more like a bell. I don't seek retribution. I seek accountability. My words landed not as accusation, but as evidence of steadiness. As night fell, Brightcore's lobby emptied into a cooler, quieter city. The glass facade reflected a fractured skyline. Ryan's name trended for reasons he had not imagined. His allies hovered on the edges, making quiet calls and soft arguments, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. I walked home under streetlights, the city making small constellations on wet pavement. People looked like ghosts in windows, half seen and hurried. I did not celebrate. I thought about the months that would follow: legal battles, corporate restructuring, reputational hemorrhage. I thought about Melissa and Raj and Lisa, small, human constellations who had lit the path through darkness. In the end, the revenge wasn't spectacle, it was restoration. It wasn't about shaming him into ruin, it was about letting procedure work the justice his arrogance had avoided. The systems he'd gamed were, in their own quiet way, the instruments of his undoing. As I passed the office one last time that night, I didn't look back. The city hummed around me, and a cold clarity settled in my chest, not pleasure, but a sterile, absolute peace. He had performed my firing on a stage. I returned the favor with a ledger. The applause this time was for truth. Morning came slower these days, quieter, gentler, as if the city had finally exhaled. The scandal had burned through Brightcore like a fever, leaving behind a leaner, more honest organism. Ryan's name was no longer on the door. His office, once a small kingdom of manipulation, had been stripped bare. A temporary director took his place, and policies I had written long ago, dismissed as idealistic, were reinstated company-wide. But this wasn't about the company anymore. It was about what came after the fire. I left Brightcore 3 weeks later. No drama, no press release, just a quiet signature on an exit letter that felt more like a benediction than a resignation. I'd done what I came to do: reveal truth, restore dignity, reclaim myself. The weight I'd carried, the one that pressed into my chest every time I doubted my worth, was gone. Freedom didn't roar. It whispered. I rented a small studio overlooking the river, a place with high ceilings, plants that leaned toward sunlight, and silence that didn't hurt anymore. Some mornings, I'd sit by the window with coffee, watching the water move, not hurried, not fighting, and think, so this is peace. The first few days, I kept waiting for the rush, the vindication, the cinematic swell. But what came instead was stillness, deep, grounding, human. That's when I realized, true justice isn't about triumph. It's about return. Returning to yourself after someone tried to rewrite you. Ryan's downfall unfolded slowly, methodically. His accounts were audited, contracts nullified, professional network evaporated. The same charm that once opened doors now raised eyebrows. Whispers of ethical breach followed him into every interview, every potential investor meeting. The empire he'd stolen bricks for collapsed not with an explosion, but with the sound of doors quietly closing. And yet, I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in destruction, only in restoration. Melissa found a position at another firm, one that valued her conscience more than her compliance. Raj stayed in touch, sending small updates. "They're implementing your transparency protocol," he wrote one evening. They even named it the heart system. I smiled, not the polite kind I'd worn in boardrooms, but the full kind that starts somewhere near your ribs. The city kept moving, but I had stopped chasing it. I had stopped chasing proving myself. That was the lesson the betrayal had carved into me. When people steal your credit, your peace, your light, don't waste your energy proving them wrong. Build something truer instead. Betrayal had once felt like ruin, now it felt like a strange kind of rebirth. It stripped me of illusions about loyalty, about validation, about who deserves my trust. And in that clearing, I found a self I hadn't met before, unflinching, deliberate, untamed by anyone's version of my story. One evening, months later, I saw Ryan again on the screen of a news site, half hidden behind a quote from his attorney. He looked older, smaller. The article mentioned pending investigations, non-compete violations, and settlement terms undisclosed. I closed the tab, not out of pity or joy, but closure. His name no longer carried weight inside me. My reflection in the darkened window looked back steady and unafraid. The woman who'd once cried in office bathrooms was gone. The woman who replaced her had learned that silence can roar louder than revenge. Before bed that night, I opened my journal, the same one I'd used to map every lie, every plan, every step toward justice. I wrote one line across the final page: "He taught me betrayal." I taught him consequence. It was not bitterness. It was balance. And that, I realized, was poetic justice, not his fall, but my rise. To those of you watching this, maybe you've known what it feels like to be underestimated, to have your light stolen and your worth dismissed. Maybe someone tried to erase your name from what you built. But hear this, you can reclaim every piece of yourself. You can rebuild from ashes that still glow. You can forgive, not because they deserve peace, but because you do. Tell me in the comments, have you ever faced betrayal that forced you to become stronger? How did you rise from it? I'd love to hear your story. And if this chapter spoke to you, if you believe in truth that outlasts deceit, subscribe, because our stories don't end at pain. They begin again in power. He lost everything pretending to be me. I found everything by finally being myself.